The streets thrummed with a youthful energy. They came in droves, a sea of faces reflecting the simmering discontent. These were not seasoned protesters, hardened by years of political struggle. These were Ivory Coast youth, many of them experiencing the intoxicating thrill of resistance for the first time. They chanted, they marched, they dared to challenge the established order. Their cause? A man they had never met, leading a country hundreds of miles away. They called his name like a prayer. Traoré, Traoré! Their own leaders, they felt, had failed them. They saw in Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso's enigmatic leader, a beacon of hope. He was a man who spoke their language, who promised to reclaim their destinies from the grip of foreign powers. He nationalized their resources, expelled Western corporations, and dared to challenge the old guard. He was a symbol of defiance, a testament to the power of self-determination. And in him, the youth of Ivory Coast saw a reflection of their own unfulfilled aspirations. The streets were alive with the fervor of a generation that had grown weary of empty promises and stagnant leadership. They were not just protesting, they were demanding a future that had been denied to them for far too long. The air was thick with the scent of change, and the voices of the young echoed through the streets like a clarion call for justice. These young men and women were not just fighting for a leader in a distant land. They were fighting for their own right to dream, to hope, and to build a better tomorrow. They were united by a common cause, a shared vision of a future where their voices mattered, where their lives were valued. The energy was palpable, the determination unyielding. They were the heartbeat of a nation yearning for change, the pulse of a generation that refused to be silenced. Their chants grew louder, their resolve stronger, as they marched forward, undeterred by the challenges that lay ahead. In the face of adversity, they found strength in their unity, courage in their numbers. They were not just a crowd, they were a movement, a force to be reckoned with. And as they called out Traoré's name, they were not just invoking a leader, they were invoking a spirit of resistance, a call to action that resonated deep within their souls. This was more than a protest. It was a declaration of their right to shape their own destiny. It was a testament to their resilience, their unwavering belief in a future where they could thrive, free from the shackles of oppression and foreign domination. And as the sun set on that day, the streets of Ivory Coast were forever changed, marked by the indomitable spirit of its youth. They had risen, not just as individuals, but as a generation united in their quest for justice, equality, and self-determination. And in their rise, they carried the hopes and dreams of an entire nation, lighting the way for a brighter, more just future. Ibrahim Traoré was a man of contradictions, a figure who embodied both the hopes and fears of a nation in turmoil. A military leader who spoke the language of revolution, he was as much a symbol of change as he was a product of the very system he sought to dismantle. He rose to power in Burkina Faso on a wave of popular discontent, a groundswell of frustration that had been building for years. The people were tired of broken promises and unfulfilled dreams. Promising to restore order and security to a nation ravaged by Islamist insurgency, Traoré's message resonated deeply with a populace desperate for peace and stability. But Traoré's vision extended far beyond the battlefield. He saw the challenges facing Burkina Faso as part of a larger, more complex tapestry of issues that plagued the African continent. He saw Burkina Faso's struggles as symptomatic of a deeper malaise afflicting the African continent, a malaise rooted in historical injustices and ongoing exploitation. The lingering legacy of colonialism, which had left deep scars on the social and economic fabric of the nation. The exploitation of its resources, often by foreign entities, had enriched a few while impoverishing many. The stifling grip of Western powers on its political and economic destinies was a reality he could not ignore. His policies were bold, some would say reckless. He expelled French troops, nationalized gold mines, and forged alliances with Russia and Cuba. He postponed elections, arguing that security concerns took precedence over political expediency. To many, these moves were necessary steps to reclaim national sovereignty. Arguing that security concerns took precedence over political expediency, he believed that a stable nation was a prerequisite for any meaningful democratic process. His critics accused him of authoritarianism, of sacrificing democracy on the altar of stability. They argued that his methods were heavy-handed and undemocratic. They saw him as a man who was willing to trample on civil liberties to achieve his goals. But to his supporters, mostly the young and disaffected, he was a hero, a beacon of hope in a landscape of despair. They saw in him a leader who dared to challenge the status quo, a man who dared to challenge the status quo and reclaim their nation's sovereignty. To them, he was not just a leader, but a symbol of a brighter future, a future where their voices would finally be heard. Traoré's rhetoric, his fiery pronouncements against neocolonialism, resonated deeply with many Ivorians, particularly the young. They saw in him echoes of Thomas Sankara, Burkina Faso's iconic revolutionary leader who was assassinated in 1987. Sankara, like Traoré, had dared to envision a different kind of Africa, one free from foreign interference and exploitation. He too had nationalized resources, challenged Western hegemony, and sought to empower the masses. But Sankara's revolutionary zeal had been cut short, betrayed by his own comrade-in-arms, Blaise Compaoré. Now, decades later, Compaoré lived in exile in Ivory Coast, sheltered by a government that many saw as complicit in Sankara's assassination. For the Ivorian youth, the irony was unbearable. How could their leaders condemn Traoré for following in the footsteps of a man they themselves had helped to silence? Traoré's ascent to power sent shockwaves across West Africa, exposing the deep fissures that ran through the region's political landscape. The economic community of West African states, dominated by francophone countries with close ties to France, viewed Traoré's government with suspicion. His expulsion of French troops, his embrace of Russia, and his challenge to the CFA franc, seen by many as a symbol of French economic control, were seen as threats to the established order. Ivory Coast, under President Alassane Ouattara, a staunch ally of France in the West, found itself increasingly at odds with its neighbor. Ouattara's government, accused of corruption and human rights abuses, represented everything the Ivorian youth despised, a continuation of the old guard, beholden to foreign interests, and deaf to the aspirations of its people. Section 5. Ivory Coast, a powder keg. Ivory Coast itself was a nation on edge, teetering on the brink of both hope and despair. The country, known for its vibrant culture and economic potential, was also a land of deep-seated tensions and unresolved conflicts. The scars of the 2010 to 2011 post-election violence, which had claimed thousands of lives, were still fresh. The memories of those dark days lingered in the minds of the people, a constant reminder of the fragility of peace. The economy, though officially booming, had failed to deliver tangible benefits for the majority of the population, particularly the youth. Despite impressive GDP growth figures, the wealth was concentrated in the hands of a few, leaving many to struggle in poverty. Unemployment was rampant, social services were stretched thin, and frustration simmered beneath the surface. The young people, who made up a significant portion of the population, felt particularly disenfranchised and overlooked by those in power. Into this volatile mix stepped Traoré, his every move scrutinized, his every word amplified by social media. He was a charismatic figure, whose speeches resonated with the disillusioned youth, offering them a glimmer of hope in an otherwise bleak landscape. He became a lightning rod for the hopes and frustrations of a generation yearning for change. His rallies drew massive crowds, and his message of empowerment and self-determination struck a chord with many. His defiance of the West, his embrace of Pan-Africanism, his promise to put the needs of his people first, resonated deeply with the Ivorian youth. They saw in him a leader who understood their struggles and was willing to fight for their future, who saw in him a reflection of their own unfulfilled aspirations. Traoré's rise was not just a political phenomenon, it was a social movement, a collective cry for justice, equality, and a better tomorrow. The youth of Ivory Coast, with their dreams and determination, were ready to stand behind him, hoping that he could turn their aspirations into reality. Section 6. The Price of Dissent. The Ivorian government, alarmed by the growing popularity of Traoré and the potential for unrest, responded with a heavy hand. Protests were broken up, activists were arrested, and critical voices were silenced. The media, largely controlled by the government, painted Traoré as a dangerous radical, a threat to regional stability. But the crackdown only served to fuel the flames of dissent. The youth, emboldened by their counterparts in Burkina Faso, refused to be silenced. They organized online using social media to circumvent state censorship and spread their message of defiance. The name Traoré became a rallying cry, a symbol of resistance against a system they perceived as corrupt and unjust. Section 7. A Coup and Its Aftermath. Tensions between Burkina Faso and Ivory Coast reached boiling point in April 2025, when a coup attempt against Traoré was foiled in Ouagadougou. The Burkinabe government accused Ivory Coast of harboring the coup plotters, alleging that they had received support from elements within the Ivorian security forces. Ivory Coast denied any involvement, but the damage was done. The attempted coup, whether real or fabricated, played perfectly into the narrative of both sides. Traoré used it to rally support at home, portraying himself as a victim of foreign machinations. The Ivorian government, in turn, used it to justify its crackdown on dissent, accusing Traoré's supporters of being agents of instability. Section 8. The Shifting Sands of West Africa. The standoff between Burkina Faso and Ivory Coast highlighted the shifting sands of West African politics. The old order, characterized by French dominance and the unquestioned authority of long-serving leaders, was being challenged by a new generation, emboldened by social media, inspired by leaders like Traoré, and increasingly disillusioned with the status quo. This new generation, though diverse in its views and aspirations, shared a common desire for change. They wanted leaders who would prioritize their needs, who would fight for their interests, and who would represent their aspirations on the global stage. They were done with the old ways of doing things, tired of the corruption, the inequality, and the lack of opportunity. Section 9. A New Generation, a New Hope. The youth of Ivory Coast, in standing up for Traoré, were not necessarily endorsing his every policy or condoning his methods. They were expressing their own yearning for a different kind of leadership, one that reflected their values and aspirations. They were demanding a seat at the table, a voice in their own destinies. The road ahead would be long and arduous. The forces of the status quo were deeply entrenched, and the struggle for change would be met with resistance. But the youth of Ivory Coast, like their counterparts across the continent, had found their voice. They were no longer content to be passive bystanders in